Class, Chapter 8 is on institutions, and it begins by asking the question, when it comes down to it, regardless of social construction and social pressure, don't we live in a society in which it's possible to just be an individual? And this chapter starts with that question because it reminds us, despite the fact that, we live in a society that often views things through those gender binary glasses and has gender norms related to people's gender performances, and a society where people engage in gender policing. They self-police as well as police other people. Despite all of that, there are people out there, of course, who get away with breaking gender rules, and some that even form communities that support the gender rules, the breaking of gender rules. And so it would seem like that, despite the gender binary, and the strong pressure that people face to kind of do gender the societally correct way, can a person live a gender neutral or gender fluid life if she or he wants to, or them if they want to? So that's kind of the logic underlying that question. And so the quick and dirty answer to this question is no. And that's because, gender isn't just this individual identity trait. As your book notes, it's a set of ideas that are an organizing principle that a lot of our society is built around and based around. It shapes our environment in a multitude of ways, and it's really difficult to live our lives independent of gender. Of course, we can push back, we can reject the gender binary, and obviously there are people who do. But that doesn't mean that we will be free of gender. And in order to understand that, we're going to talk about in this chapter, how is gender institutionalized in our society, how it goes beyond the micro level, how it exists at the macro level, beyond anyone's individual decisions regarding, what to wear or what pronouns to use, or, what to name their child. Gender exists and is built into the institutions our society is built around. So in order to understand this, we're going to have to talk about some sociology terms, and some are in the book and some aren't. I tried to make this clear by indicating the ones that are in the book with the kind of pinkish purple text color, and the ones that aren't in the book but I am going to touch upon are in the blue color. So human society can be broken down into two parts. There is social structure, and the definition that your book gives for this is it is the entire set of interlocked institutions within which we live our lives. Social structure creates the scaffolding on which we build our lives, and thus it both enables us to make some decisions, as well as constrains us, prevents us from having some opportunities. And there are five primary components of social structure, and they are status, social statuses. These are the identities that we have, these socially identified positions that kind of conscribe our place within the social structure. I am a professor, I am someone's daughter, I am a friend, I am a pet owner, I'm Black, I am a woman, I am heterosexual, right? I didn't create any of those statuses. They exist within my society. And then some of those statuses I chose, achieve statuses, and some of those statuses I was born with, ascribed statuses. Most of those statuses come with expectations regarding behavior, and we call those social roles. And of course, this is kind of what allows our interactions with other people, even people we don't know. This is what allows those interactions to largely be predictable, that we know what to expect. You go in and you buy, a soda from the clerk at the gas station. You kind of know how that person is going to respond to you, because in that moment they are holding a status, clerk at a gas station, and that status comes with a social role, behavioral standards of behavior. Then there are groups. And so groups can be classified as primary groups. They can be classified as secondary groups. We have our in groups, we have our out groups. But basically this speaks to the kind of collectivities and communities that we form, that give our life meaning, that socialize us, that shape our beliefs and our values, and other kind of elements of non-material culture and material culture, which we'll talk about in a second here. Social networks. This is one way of kind of describing, our linkages with other people, who we are linked to in society and how. And then finally, social institutions, which is the form of social structure that your book is most focused on. And so we'll talk a little bit more about, or we'll talk a lot more about that one. But, social institutions are persistent patterns of social interaction aimed at meeting a need of society that can't easily be met by individuals alone. So this is basically how society organizes itself so that it can meet its societal needs. The other part of human society is culture. And culture is the ways of thinking, ways of acting, and the material objects that together form a people's way of life. So when I teach intro sociology, I sometimes describe it as social structure is like the framework of your house, and culture is, everything that goes in it and happens within it. And so if you're talking about artifacts, the actual material objects that make up a culture, or if you're talking about technology, the knowledge needed in order to work within that society, then you're referring to what's called material culture. And sometimes students get tripped up on technology because of, the technology that a lot of us use now, of course, our internet and our Wi-Fi and our, microchip, and we sometimes think of those things as not being visible, not being tangible, but it's worth noting that, thousands of years ago, the technology was the plow, or, the cotton gin, the steam engine, the automobile, right? All of those, types of things, which were obviously a lot more tangible. But material culture is that. And of course, artifacts are your clothes, your food, your art, your books, your cars, your toys, the furniture in your homes. All of that is considered artifacts. And then there's non-material culture. This is the ways of thinking and acting component of culture. And another kind of way of thinking about that is non-material culture can be split into, your gestures and your language, the kind of gestures that we use to non-verbally communicate, and then as well, of course, our verbal communication, and then what we call ideology, which is the kind of the mindset that we have, in order to understand our culture. This is how we explain and understand our own culture, how we make sense of it, how we give it meaning. And ideology has three primary components: values, beliefs and norms. And norms is what your book focuses on. And norms are basically just expectations of behavior. And they can be broken down into different types. You have your informal norms, which another way of referring to those are folkways. There are mores, which basically are norms that we feel like are very significant and important to the kind of functioning, the morality of our society. Some of those are formal norms, norms that are written down, that are encoded in law and policy. But some of those mores can also be informal norms. The informalness refers to, have they been enshrined in law or policy, not their level of significance, because there are mores that are, that people would say are very important, especially ones that, intersect with religion or morality, but not all of those are necessarily encoded in the law. And laws and policies are formal norms, because these are norms that an organization or an entity has turned into law and policy, which gives them the ability to not just enact them, but then to enforce them, and usually gives them some type of legal or organizational recourse, to punish people who break them. And your book in particular focuses on policies. Now, how do we learn all this? Well, the terms themselves you probably learned to some extent if you took an introductory to sociology class. But if you're thinking about, how did you in fact, learn what, the middle finger means in American culture, why it's important to be honest, the dress codes at your high school, what does it mean to be a friend, what was expected of you at your first job. You learned all of this through the process of socialization, which we've talked about in this class, specifically in regards to gender socialization. How do we learn what is expected of us based upon our gender? But just, once again, a callback to introductory sociology, socialization is much broader than that. That's just the process of learning, learning what is expected of you in society, learning the social structure and learning the culture. So these terms should make it clear, why we can't just be an individual, because although we can push back, although we can reject, some of what's expected of us, the fact of the matter is as an individual, what we can't really change are, people's expectations of us based on social structure and culture, people's perceptions of us based on social structure and culture. And so your book makes the point on page 193 to 194, particularly about the inescapability of social institutions, because, out of all of the components of social structure, social institutions is the one that exists on the macro level. And thus, it is the one that we as individuals have kind of the least amount of power to change, or even ignore all by ourselves. So that point from 193, because institutions are about collectively meeting the needs of individuals, they are very different from the social forces we've discussed so far. We can try to get cultural ideas we don't like out of our brains, surround ourselves with people who support our personal choices, and accept whatever consequences come with breaking social rules. But it is essentially impossible to avoid institutions. They impose themselves on our lives. And that's because what we call social institutions are things like, family, religion, education, the economy, medicine, politics, law, science, military, mass media. And all of those social institutions are related to specific basic needs of society. So this is how society has organized itself, has organized patterns of behavior, organizations to address those needs. And so if you're going to live in a society, it's going to be almost impossible to to resist and to avoid social institutions. I guess maybe if you left society and you lived off the grid as a hermit somewhere, you could avoid a lot of these things. But for most of us, whether we necessarily agree with dominant ideology or not, the expectations related to family, the specific policies related to education, especially, kind of the mandated policies around primary and secondary education, politics, right? You can choose to be a non-voter, you can choose to, not really follow it, but nevertheless, all around you, people elect politicians, and those politicians enact policies that impact your lives, or they nominate judges who make, trial decisions that impact your lives. The law, regardless of how you feel about the police, the fact of the matter is, or the court system, the fact of the matter is, in our society, this is how we maintain social order. You can't just, fully ignore that. So there are, you can't avoid social institutions, as your book discusses, as your book states, they're inescapable. Now, when social institutions are gendered, they are referred to as gendered institutions by the author. And so, a gendered institution is one where gender is used as an organizing principle, that men and women are channeled into different and often differently valued social spaces or activities, and then their choices have different and often unequal consequences. And so basically, these are institutions that are based upon that gender binary ideology, and then within these institutions, whether or not you're a man or woman really directly impacts how you're treated, how do you exist within that institution, what's expected of you, what opportunities are provided for you, what constraints are placed upon you. And so, the logic of the gender binary informs the organization of these institutions, and the extent to which this happens can be captured by the concept of gender salience. How relevant is gender across the context, the activities, and the spaces that, rise from the different parts of that institution. And so gendered institutions are problematic because they both affirm and enforce gender difference and inequality. So, they affirm the idea, oh, men and women are different. And then it usually gives rise, by focusing on that gender difference, it usually gives rise to inequality. So, sometimes we don't even think about this. So, think about the fact that clothing in stores is used to differentiate male-bodied spaces from female-bodied spaces, right? Even when men and women are wearing the same clothes or the same type of clothes, we put women's t-shirts in the women's section, we put men's t-shirts in the t-shirt in the men's section, women's sweatpants in the women's section, men's sweatpants in the men's section. And sometimes it's even in the clothing itself. There's a really interesting article about the history as to why men and women's shirts button on different sides. It dates all the way back to when people used to fight duels. And it just kind of shows that, once something becomes institutionalized, it becomes the normative way of doing that particular thing, of meeting that particular need. It then can be resistant to change, and we're going to talk about this later on in this chapter. So let's take a closer look at one particular kind of gendered institution, bathrooms. Public sanitation is a gendered institution. And I emphasize the word public there because it's usually the bathroom organization in public places. It's a very rare home, like I literally have never been in one, where they have a men's and a women's bathroom in a private home, in your own domicile, right? If any of you did have that growing up or have that now, please let me know, because you would maybe be the first. So instead, so we share a bathroom with, the people, with everyone in our home, regardless of their gender. But when we are going to the bathroom out in public, then all of a sudden this becomes a gendered, institution, in the sense that, there is a men's room and there's a women's room. They're usually clearly marked. And, your book notes the fact that, obviously, the idea that men and women need separate spaces for bathrooms, it rises out of the older idea that people need to privacy, in order to handle their kind of bodily functions. Because as they note, in early history, as well as in certain parts of the world, people still largely, publicly urinate and defecate. And so it was only when we started to focus on the need for privacy for bodily functions that then slowly out of that then became a concern for then sex segregated bathrooms. And so, it was, this idea emerged during the 1800s. And a lot of this is because this is the time period, as we're entering into the mid to late 1800s. So this time period of industrialization and urbanization. So what you have is a growth of people in the cities, and you also have men and women commingling in public spaces, particularly workspaces, factories, for in significant numbers for the first time in human history, right? Because no one was concerned about gender segregated bathrooms when people were largely living on farms, and working on their family farm. So it was during this industrial revolution time period, and part of the concern is because there was this kind of ideology at that time that came out of the Victorian era, that men and women were very different, that women were more fragile, and that their bodies were different, and so this is also, where we have the emergence of the term restroom, which, today we kind of use to mean bathroom. But at the time that this term emerged, restrooms were meant to be like the small private rooms that were kind of outside of the bathroom. And so, it was placed in women's bathrooms, because at that time period, it was believed that women, had these fragile bodies. They couldn't withstand strain or fatigue or deprivation as well as a man. So they would need, these restrooms in case they had a sudden attack of dizziness or fainting. But your book also notes that, by providing this kind of restroom that kind of coexisted with the bathroom, but wasn't the same thing as a bathroom, it also allowed women to kind of maintain this allure of privacy, of being able to say that they are, going to the restroom to rest, as opposed to going to the bathroom, to engage in kind of, bodily functions like defecation or urination, because of course, people did not like to think about women's bodies doing that sort of thing. So, at some point, this became such common practice, right? This norm, this informal norm of, men and women need separate bathrooms, women need a restroom in addition to their bathroom, that, it wasn't long until it became formalized. So in the United States, in 1887, Massachusetts enacted the first law mandating sex segregated bathrooms in public spaces. And by 1920, 43 states had these types of law. And today, every state requires the provision of separate bathrooms for men and women in public spaces. And so, once again, it just kind of shows you how something, can move from being a normative behavior, an informal norm, to a formal norm, and then it takes on popularity, and then it just becomes fully institutionalized, because that's what it is today. And so, sex segregated bathrooms, your book notes, they serve a social function, more so than a biological function, right? It allows, people, it builds upon that idea that, women, it's unladylike for women to have these bodily functions, and that, the segregation of the bathrooms gives women like the privacy to engage in this shameful behavior. And, it also is imagined to be a sexuality-free space, because it's the idea, while you're engaging in these bodily functions, you need to protect your private parts. So sex-segregated bathrooms are imagined to be sexuality-free. Now, of course, this assumption is problematic because, it is kind of this compulsory heterosexuality, this heteronormative type of imagining where, you're just thinking about no one is thinking sexy thoughts in the sex segregated bathroom because everyone is heterosexual. But obviously, that's not true. And I mean, maybe there are some people that think sexy thoughts in the bathroom, whether it's sex segregated or integrated. But, I would imagine for a lot of us, that's probably just, not going to be on the top of our list when we're going to the bathroom, heading to a public bathroom, regardless. And so, at the end of the day, the institutionalized nature of bathrooms in the United States upholds the gender binary. And this becomes problematic, not just when you think about people who are transgender, or people who are gender fluid or gender nonconforming, but even people who are cisgender but do not necessarily physically look, to be their gender. Your book notes that those people oftentimes have, stories of being harassed or, treated suspiciously, when they are just trying to go to the bathroom. And so, as we have entered in like the last 10 years, the politics of bathrooms has become increasingly contested. And if you think about where does the law currently stand, first of all, you have to distinguish between federal laws and then state laws. So if we are thinking about federal laws in particular, then, one thing that you should perhaps kind of think about is that at the federal level, there has been laws passed that, kind of require, that people not necessarily, that people can go to the bathroom. Let me make sure I say this the correct way. That people can go to the bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity, in regards to their place of employment. So that is a federal law. That it is illegal for employers to force trans employees to use the bathroom that corresponds to their sex assigned at birth as opposed to their gender identity. However, such a law does not exist for trans students, which is why you have had bathroom bills that have popped up at the state level. And, at the time this book was written, they talked about the number of states that have had passed restrictive bathroom bills versus the number of states who have passed laws protecting trans people's right to use the bathroom of their choice in any public place. And there have been court cases that have made it, to the Supreme Court, around this issue. it's worth noting that for the states that pass these restrictive bathroom bills, basically saying that someone has to go to the bathroom that corresponds with the sex assigned at birth, oftentimes these bills are kind of predicated around this idea, that the idea that, you know, women in particular need to be protected because allowing trans people access to women's bathrooms is dangerous. It's just worth noting that this association between transgender and individuals and sexual predators is a faulty one. There is no empirical evidence suggesting that trans individuals have that, you know, pose a higher risk of sexual predation. What we do have evidence of is that trans individuals are oftentimes themselves victimized. They have a higher rate of victimization than of sexual and violent crimes than they do of perpetuating those types of crimes. But nevertheless, you know, this is an effective marketing strategy, saying that you, you know, don't support, you know, or saying that you support these restrictive bathroom bills because you care about protecting, you know, women, or you're concerned about protecting children. You know, it is couched in terms that people feel more comfortable espousing versus, you know, I support not allowing trans gender individuals, you know, the right to use the bathroom of their choice. You know, when you say it that way, you know, it doesn't sound as it doesn't sound as morally upstanding. You know, and it's just worth noting that your book talks about, you know, there is a history of these types of claims in our country. They've been used to argue against integrated bathrooms because of fears related to both, you know, Black men as aggression and violence, and Black women as supposedly carriers of disease. So this idea that, you know, certain types of people in our society need to be protected from these scary other people, you know, is a kind of a time-tested claim in our country, one that is trotted out on a regular basis. So, you know, the pushback against bathrooms, sex segregated bathrooms, the institutionalization of sex segregated bathrooms, you know, this is something that we are currently living through right now. And I'll come back to this at the end of the chapter when we talk about institutional change and institutional inertia. But let's move to another gendered institution discussed by your book, which was sports. So when you think about what role does sports play in the American culture and how sports as an institution shape our experience, you know, your book offers a really great discussion of like all the ways in which, you know, sports, you know, shapes American life. You know, it impacts our economy. It impacts our recreational activities, whether we're playing or enjoying as a fan. It provides educational opportunities. It provides professional careers, and some of those professional careers are extremely lucrative. If you think about sports and like the Olympics, it's a part of our national identity. So sports are a really big deal in American culture. Sports have also been consistently and traditionally gendered in our society. So when you think about the relationship between sports and masculinity as opposed to sports and femininity, you know, what are some highlights? You know, your book talks about, you know, for women, bicycling was one of the first recreational physical activities taken up by women in the late 1800s, you know, and it changed people's lives. You know, it allowed them to have freedom. It allowed them to have mobility. It gave them greater independence. It moved them away from more restrictive clothing. as your book note, a lot of people did not like it. Doctors warned that women's bodies weren't created for exertion. And people said that it made women unattractive. They looked unattractive when biking, and that wasn't attractive to men. But despite that kind of pushback, women fought to continue to bike, to have their bikes. And so, I think they start with that kind of vignette to show that, although sports have never been as encouraged in women as they are in men, that, and certainly that lack of societal encouragement and that lack of institutionalization for women as opposed to men does result in, less women, for instance, watching sports, less women, being, involved in sports, at the professional level. And we'll talk about the school level and how Title IX changed that. But, in terms of adults, recreation fans, so it is important to note that, I took a pause, my dogs were barking, but it's just the idea that, despite sports not necessarily historically being geared or targeted towards women, institutionalized, in women's way of life the way they were for men, nevertheless, the fact that, women who pursue athletics, women who are fans of sports, women who are fans of, exercise in terms of recreation, the fact that it exists at all just shows that, of course, people can make individual decisions within an institution. They can resist, they can push back, even if they have limitations on how much they can change the institution itself. Now, for men, it's almost the opposite. As your book notes, sports serve as manhood training and as a way to demonstrate real boyhood and manhood. Your participation and skill and prowess in sports, the extent to your athleticism, can impact your placement in the hierarchy of masculinity. Certainly, a lack of athleticism might distinguish you from being identified as having hegemonic masculinity, as opposed to complicit masculinity. Sports like football in particular, or other kind of violent contact sports, serve as a cultural testament to gender difference. Your book makes a really interesting point about the symbolic link between male athletes and male spectators. So they will say things like, oh, well, men and women, of course, men and women are different. Of course, men are stronger than women. Men are tougher than women. Women could never, take a hit on a football field. Of course, ignoring the fact that, most everyday men also could not take a hit on a football field. But that's what's meant by that symbolic link. They have a link with those male athletes on the basis of their shared maleness. Now, all of this, of course, has been complicated in the last 40 to 50 years by the growing trend of women playing sports, at the high school, at the collegiate, and even at the professional level. But there are some gender differences. There are what's considered gendered styles of play and gendered expectations for athletes. That oftentimes athletics is kind of associated with being tough. So, you're told things like, suck it up, take it like a man, don't be a punk, don't be a wuss, there is no crying, except there's this great article I used to use saying, how the one acceptable moment, one shining moment, the number of college basketball players that cry when they win the championship, the national championship, and how we've kind of created this cultural space, giving them like permission to do that, even though that kind of goes against hegemonic masculine ideals. But for most sports, of course, there is this sense like, that you're not going to cry. And there's that whole no crying in baseball scene from A League of Their Own. And so that frequently comes up when talking about female athletes. that, that they're supposed to be better sports. They're supposed to, uh, more emphasize things like camaraderie and teamwork and and good sportsmanship. And it's not that men aren't expected or supposed to do that, but they are less pushed to do that, and there are less consequences if they break those norms. Your book discusses how, because sports have been defined in masculine traits, sports dominated by women and traits more likely to be held by women are either not seen as sports or seen as lesser sports. So they talk about, because we, emphasize size and speed and strength, and on average, these are qualities that men excel at more so than women. Sports that involve things like balance and flexibility, sports like gymnastics, for instance, they're seen as lesser sports. Ribbon dancing, synchronized swimming, so they're either defined as not being sports at all, or they're seen as lesser sports, because the qualities, the athletic qualities, and it does take athleticism to do those types of activities. Those qualities are just not what we think of when we think of sport. And that's because mass media institution, it has certainly kind of helped shape, what we define as being indicative of a sport versus what we don't define as being indicative of a sport. And so this contributes to the assumption that women are lesser athletes, because if you're going to focus on size, strength, speed, the fastest woman is going to be slower than the fastest man. The strongest woman is going to be is not going to be as strong as the strongest man. And of course, this goes back to what was discussed. Of course, that symbolic link. That the fastest man is a stand-in for all men, because of course what we're ignoring is that the strongest woman is probably stronger than a lot of men. The fastest woman is faster than a lot of men, but because she is not as fast or as strong as the strongest or fastest man, it leads to kind of this kind of population level kind of devaluing of women. And, it pops up in things like the compliment of saying, she plays like a man, versus the insult of throwing like a girl, right? It's embedded right there in the words, the assumption that playing like a man is a good thing because all men are great athletes, and versus the devaluing of female athleticism, because, certainly some women, throw really well. If you think about, softball players, or, other sports that involve throwing, passing basketballs, but instead we have this very kind of devalued image when we say throw like a girl. I didn't include this link, but I feel like a great example of this, if you want to find it on YouTube, one of the late night comedians, maybe it was Jimmy Kimmel, maybe it was Jimmy Fallon, they set this up where they had Serena Williams basically hit a couple of tennis balls to, regular men who, the type of men that pop up in comments, kind of downplaying Serena Williams' like strength and skill at tennis. Once again, going back to that kind of symbolic link, because they feel like there are male tennis pros that she can't beat. The stand-in becomes she also can't beat a average man. And so what's great about this video is, you get to watch Serena Williams, like, just knock the hell out of these tennis balls towards these regular guys who usually wind up kind of cowering and dropping their rackets and, running around the court trying to avoid getting hit. And it's just a good example, of course, that, the fact that we aren't thinking of female athletes, that we kind of culturally devalue female athleticism and downplay it, even when we clearly have examples that should cause us to second guess our tendency to do that. So your book makes an interesting point about what is sex segregation in sports for. They say that it affirms cultural beliefs in gender difference and inequality. It allows us to require that men and women perform the same sports differently, which then contributes to the idea that men and women have fundamentally different physical abilities. And they talk about this in terms of the checking rule in hockey, tackle versus flag versus powder puff football, baseball versus softball, that different courses for men and women are different in terms of obstacles and difficulty. If you're talking about like BMX or downhill skiing, so we put those rules out there and we institutionalize them. So it's like, if you're going to play this sport, you're going to play by these rules. And if you're a man, you're going to play by this set of rules. And if you're a woman, you're going to play by this set of rules. And then we watch men and women play. And this leads us to then make assumptions about what we're observing when we see these different levels of play. Instead of us thinking like, oh, this might be because of the policies in place, instead we think of things, we relate it back to what we feel like are innate differences. Women are just less aggressive, right? We might say that if we see the, if we compare a women's hockey game to a men's hockey game, where we might say, women can't stick that jump or landing. They can't jump as high on the mountain bike or whatever, if we're watching, a BMX race. We're not thinking about the fact that the sports themselves have these formal norms, these policies that have institutionalized the difference. Another example would be the different aesthetic expectations for male and female athletes, for bodybuilding and figure skating. That oftentimes figure skating, through their costumes, through their makeup, through their body shapes, women are expected to de-emphasize the athleticism and the musculature it takes to land those jumps and do those types of routines. Similarly for bodybuilding, of course it is more difficult for women to put on a good deal of muscle compared to men. It is not impossible. But by imposing restrictions on how much muscle that women can put on, and in some cases even eliminating those types of competitions altogether, of course, this then builds into the idea that there's no way for women to, put on a lot of muscle, right? Like, it's physically impossible. When instead of being physically impossible, what it really is it's been deemed culturally undesirable. The kind of other way or other point that your book makes about the role of sex segregation is it protects a belief in the hierarchical gender binary by ensuring that men and women never compete against one another. This protects the assumption that men are always better, stronger, faster, more athletically skilled than women by allowing it to largely go untested. And your book does say, hey, especially for some sports that rely on strength, that rely on speed, as I said, the fastest man is going to be faster than the faster woman, but there are going to be plenty of men, and not just, unathletic, straight off the couch men, but other men who are athletes that fastest woman is going to be able to beat. And what it would do is it would kind of create a more complicated, but also a more accurate kind of assessment of the reality of the situation, as opposed to what we have now, where the best woman never competes against the best man. And so the assumption is just the best man is always better than the best woman. But, it's hard to really to test that if we don't have integrated sports. So, what could we do besides sex segregation? We could do weight classes, which apparently I misspelled weight. They talk about how this has already been used in wrestling, and how it could maybe work in other sports. We could organize sports like basketball and football by size instead of sex. We could organize by skill and ability, qualifying times, qualifying lifts instead of sex. So there are other things that could be done. And they make the argument that there would be some benefits of sex integration in sports. It would open sports to everyone, including those who currently have had difficulty finding their place in gender binary sports teams. This would be people who are intersex, transgender men and women, cisgender men and women of all shapes and sizes. The authors make an interesting argument that it might make some sports more, not less interesting. You know, that if it isn't necessarily, if all leagues aren't necessarily, you know, focused on the biggest or the fastest, you know, who knows what types of ways in which the play would change if other skills had to be emphasized. It would make it easier to address the issue of fair pay. You know, right now, segregated professional sports has contributed to wide disparities in pay, and it's due less to differences in skill and athleticism and more due to differences in viewership, endorsements, and media coverage. And a lot of that is, of course, related to people's kind of sexist beliefs about women being lesser athletes and women's athleticism being devalued on a cultural level. And so your textbook refers to this as differences in social significance, not athleticism. So it's not that female professional athletes are not as good of an athlete as male professional athletes, but they do not have the same level of social significance, and that translates into lower viewership, you know, diminished media coverage, you know, less endorsements. And then, of course, it would test and complicate that gender binary assumption that men are inherently better athletes. So could this happen, right? Or if you're listening to this, like, that's never going to happen. Well, this brings me to kind of my final points in regards to this chapter. And this is the question: are institutions more prone to staying the same or changing? If they are prone to staying the same, we call this institutional inertia. If they are changeable, then we call this institutional change. So, you know, it's worth noting institutions are more prone to institutional inertia. And a good example to highlight why that is let's return to bathrooms. So your book discusses the example of how there was the proposal for gender neutral bathrooms at the university, NYU, New York University. And so, you know, they were redoing the building, and they were going to do a gender neutral bathroom. However, the initiative wound up failing. And one reason was related to inconvenience and expense. The contractors and designers, they were more familiar with the requirements of a sex segregated bathroom. And so it just made the installation of a sex integrated one a new challenge. They had to design a new kind of bathroom, and that was going to be expensive. And then the administration didn't want to pay the extra money and didn't want to draw out the process. It was just cheaper and faster to rely on the tried and true approach, the normative, institutionalized way. And the other reason why the initiative failed had to do with the discomfort. People weren't necessarily comfortable with the idea of a gender neutral bathroom because they are used to sex segregated facilities. So they had to basically they had to apply, and the city turned them down. They talked about the fact that not everyone, even within the building, liked the idea of having a gender neutral bathroom. And so why did your textbook give you this example? And that's, the takeaway here is that doing things differently can be challenging on multiple fronts. And that isn't to say that institutions can't be changed, but changing them requires a collective shift in norms and routines. And the key word there is collective, meaning it's very difficult for one person, to kind of push and initiate and lead this change all on their own. But that doesn't mean that institutions never change, because to answer, or to provide a counterexample, let's also return to sports. So your book talks about the role of Title IX, which was passed in 1972 as an amendment to the Civil Rights Act. And the significance of Title IX is that basically it just meant that no person on the basis of sex could be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so how that's been interpreted, especially in the world of athletics, is that you have to provide the same opportunities, the same level of school funding for those opportunities in the world of athletics. And so what literally happened is, when forced by the federal government to equalize their spending, their policies, their hiring, when they were forced to equalize this, what we saw very quickly, was a rise, in the number of female athletes. Although this chart stops at 2011, it's worth noting at 2020, pretty much male and female athletes are almost at parity. They're just as likely to participate in high school sports. And what that oftentimes looks like in terms of athletics at the college level is that, there are some sports like football, of course, where there is no female equivalent. But then what that does mean is that there are other sports like rowing, for instance, or gymnastics, or, swimming, where, there won't be a men's team to compensate for that football team, because the Title IX rule is you basically have to have the same number of funded teams and the same number of funded positions between male and female athletes. So it just shows that, institutions can change, and when they do change, the people will follow. But I don't want to leave you in an accurate direction, or lead you in an inaccurate direction. They talk about the great example of Monet Davis, who pitched. She was a little league pitcher, and of course she's playing with boys, but she was a pitcher, and she was in the Little League World Series, striking out largely guys. But what she ran into in the high school level is that, she wasn't able to participate, in high school baseball, because it was for men, boys. And then, so she wound up having to switch to softball, and that's what she currently plays, is softball at the university level. And so that just shows that institutions resist change, but they are not unchangeable. But they don't change if people don't question them and take chances and buck expectations. Even then, the change doesn't necessarily happen in your lifetime. So, good for her for kind of pushing for reforms and opportunities in the world of Little League. Unfortunately, she kind of, hit some institutional barriers when it came to high school and college baseball, but that doesn't mean that the next young woman is going to run into those same barriers. And so this is what your book means when they say rocks can become a landslide. So if we return to the question, when it comes down to it, regardless of social construction and social pressure, don't we live in a society in which it's possible to just be an individual? Let's consider kind of your book's concluding thought. It's not possible then to be just an individual. Some things simply resist our personal beliefs and desires about the way the world could or should be. Gender isn't just an individual phenomena, it's an institutional one. The institutions present real opportunities and obstacles, but they prove hard to change. But even when we can't just step out of line and change society to fit our own preferences, individuals working together absolutely can and always have. And that is it for chapter 8.